So today's session was solely focused on our Storms piece, as we found out today that we would be performing this next week. As we're doing the performance in our own facility, we could rehearse in the space, which meant we could set out where the audience would be sitting. So we're performing in front of about 70 Year 11s, and we wanted the audience to be as close to us as possible to create a more intimate environment, which makes it easier for us to make a connection with the audience, as well as making it easier for us to have interactions with them. So we decided on a curved design that it's more like a thrust stage. So the back rows are closer to us and aren't so far away and aren't so distant. With the seating arrangement changed, however, it meant that we had to reevaluate some aspects of our piece, as we hadn't been rehearsing it with that staging in mind. So we did a run through and adapted it to fit with this new seating arrangement. So some of the things we had to reevaluate and make sure that we did was making sure that we spread out a bit on the stage, as there was more space. We also had to start off getting into positions earlier, for example, when we have to walk it in to create the family portrait, as there's more space to walk across, we need to start earlier to make sure that we're in position in time. We also had to make sure, something that was very prevalent, was to make sure that our backs weren't to the audience. As there's the curved staging, we had to make sure that we turned the scenes out so that all the audience could see some of what was going on, so none of the audience felt excluded from the action. We also had to think about, when we're speaking to the entire audience, as there's lots of people and lots of space to look at. If we found it quite hard at first to make this appear natural rather than forced. However, we did get the hang of it in the end after some rehearsal. Something else we did today was plan out the pattern for which group we would go to during the facilitation, when we come out into the audience and talk to them. We wanted to make sure we're very organised with this, so that we would appear more professional and there isn't any hesitancy that makes us seem very disorganised. So the pattern that we chose was, we'd choose a starting group, and then if you were stood on the front of a section of seating, you would then move on to the back of that section for the next facilitation bit. However, alternatively, if you were stood on the back, if you're talking to the back of a group of seating, you would move on to the front of the next section of seating. And this just kept everything running, all the interactions running very smoothly and seamlessly, and seeming very organised. So something else we decided to change during this rehearsal was the narrators' podiums, because they were very bulky, and we found that this meant they were hard for Charlotte to carry down the aisle. They took up too much space on the floor, which we could use for our acting and for the rest of the scene. They also blocked some of the audience view, which is a big issue, as we didn't want to make anyone feel disconnected, as we really wanted that connection with everyone in the audience to get our message across. So instead, we came up with different ideas that we could use, and we ended on deciding to use mic stands, because these are slim, more discreet, and we thought that narrators could even use microphones for their narration. as this will mean their narration is heard more clearly, which is very important as the narration plays a key role in moving the piece along, as well as setting up the facilitation, which that setup of the facilitation is very important, as it allows the audience to know what to do, so they don't get confused and they don't switch off from us, because you really need them to feel like they are connected and engaged all the way through the performance. Also, these microphones adhere to the professional image which we were trying to give to the narrators. So after this, we decided to talk through the facilitation and practice these skills using a class role play. So Sir played a difficult audience member who didn't want to join in, which is something which we could very likely experience during our performance. So we had to practice responding to this situation and speaking in such a way that we got them to open up, but also subtly guided them towards the answer that we wanted without seeming pushy. We discussed we discussed how we would first approach a facilitation. We'll first approach a facilitation with an audience member, because we didn't think it would be effective to go straight in and start talking about asking them how they, like, what they're thinking, or go straight in with the question. Instead, we thought it would be more effective to start with an icebreaker, as this will create a connection between you and the audience member, and therefore making it more likely for them to open up and more likely for them to feel comfortable enough to give their own ideas. This also humanises us and makes us seem less intimidating, which kind of we want, as we want to use our sixth form status rather than us being teachers to make us appear more approachable and more relatable, and therefore more trustworthy and more likely to be listened to. So we also discussed recapping the scene, like when we approach them, instead of just going straight into the question, recapping the scene of what just happened, so that the audience member knows exactly what they're being asked and exactly what they're being, and can have a recap of the scene which they have to kind of pinpoint these ideas from. Because we thought that a lot of the times, if they didn't know they were being tested on a scene, they might switch, or even if they did, they might switch off and miss parts of the scene and therefore become confused and then feel more distant and not feel able to join in. Whereas if we come with them and recap the scene first, they will have something to go on that they can pinpoint wherever the facilitation requires them to. So we thought that was a very good idea, because then everyone's clear on what they have to do, and no one feels at all confused or uncomfortable. So for the next thing, we also decided that for some of the facilitation, we wanted to put some answers on the board, on the PowerPoint behind us. For example, the non-verbal communication, the scene where we have to pinpoint the aspects of non-verbal communication and how they apologise in the day after. John was in the morning after John was found coming home drunk. We thought we'd put these questions on the board of things to look out for, as that is something that could spur conversation, have something for them to base their answers off, and it kind of increases the flow of conversation as they have a start and so are not confused trying to search for an answer. I also thought in the barriers scene, where we have to remove barriers that are stopping John from communicating effectively, if we have these barriers on the board behind them, they have something to start discussing and a base to begin their conversations, so they don't have to just come up with something themselves, which can lead to them feeling unsure and then being unlikely to join in, as they don't want to be vulnerable and have to give their own ideas if they're unsure and uncomfortable. So the main thing that we got from facilitation, well, from practicing our facilitation, is not to panic, and that whatever situation happens, just to respond enthusiastically and friendly, and just not ignore them or get annoyed, and just keep talking to them, and find a different, if one approach isn't working, find a different route to help guide them towards the answer. So for example, if someone's being very silent and seeming like they don't, and refusing to join in kind of thing, we could jokingly say, at this point you're displaying some non-verbal communication. So this gives them something to, this is kind of makes you seem more approachable, makes you seem more human and less intimidating, but it also makes you, well, gives them something to spur conversation off of. So you're giving an example of non-verbal communication, and then they can come up with some other examples of non-verbal communication. And even if they still don't want to talk after that, they have at least had an example of non-verbal communication that they can, which can help them identify in their own head at least, other behaviours that are non-verbal communication. So we also practice guiding them to an answer in the facilitation. So we practice this using the sliding scale. So in the sliding scale, we use 3 extreme answers: beg Holly for forgiveness, do nothing, or dump her. So what we don't really want, like the answer that we're looking for isn't really one of these extreme answers. We want something like in between these answers. So we want something in between beg her for forgiveness and do nothing, which of course is talking to her and communicating your feelings and communicating what happened. So we really want to so we practice guiding each other into choosing that answer. As we really want to promote communication and feelings as a very positive behaviour. So that's the kind of answer we are looking for and are looking for to promote positively. So then we moved on to So as also on that on that sliding scale, I thought that an approach that I could take that would help them to open up and help them from if they're struggling to see to decide what they would do, because they're struggling to see it from John's point of view, as sometimes roleplay can be hard for some people. I would change tactic and ask them more how would they respond in this situation, and make it more relatable to them, so they would be thinking about how they would respond if they were to experience the situation. Because what would be could be a helpful tactic in getting people to come up with ideas and to open up. So then we moved on to consolidate our ideas about the workshop. So we discussed where we should place the part explaining the charity and why Sue set it up with the death of her son, in response to the death of her son, which of course is a very awful, tragic story. I thought personally that it should be at the end before we talk about the leaflet, as I think we should first start the workshop by consolidating the ideas that were said in the piece and consolidating the ideas of the last scene, as well as which then leads nicely into the role play, because once we've consolidated these ideas, having the role play to then kind of apply it to, of finding out how you could apply it to your real life, it very leads on nicely in this very smooth transition. And then once we finish that, we can move on to the charity, which all of this is based on, as that makes them more likely to take the leaflet home and actually consider this, and more likely to take on the messages which they have just heard, because they can see that actually this could help somebody, and that male suicide, because of a lack of male communication, males feeling that they cannot communicate their feelings, is a very serious issue. And having them and finishing the whole piece with just with that last sentiment of the charity, and of how this charity is very much about helping males communicate to prevent male suicide. It's like a very powerful, lasting message, which makes them more likely to hold on to the messages which we've told them in the piece.